Well, this has been an interesting week as some of the news has surrounded Syracuse University sports, football, civil rights, and some other things. I'm not going to stand up and show you what I'm wearing. You'll see in the thumbnail, I'm wearing a number 44. Number 44 is a big deal, Syracuse University. As a matter of fact, they ended it in 2015, which basically says no athlete at this school, no matter what sport, can wear number 44. But there were some very big names that have worn number 44. It's a very special number. They didn't give it out every single year. What would happen was, well, basically basketball and football would determine if someone seemed like they were going to be spectacular. Not just good, spectacular. And those are the players that got, the ability to wear number 44. I'm going to start with basketball, just to give you an example. So, who I'm going to mention first, a guy named Danny Shays. Now, Danny Shays may not necessarily be a big name for everybody else, but in Syracuse, he definitely is. He basically was one of the top high school players in the country, but he stayed in Syracuse because he lived in Syracuse. He was born in the area. He made the first team Big East twice, and when he got drafted, he was drafted number 13 in the year he went, which was 1981. I actually got to see a lot of his games. We're the exact same age. He's just a few months older than me. His high school team went against my high school team, and we had an All-American also who ended up going to Notre Dame playing football. Too bad. But anyhow. And once Danny Shays got to the NBA, he stayed 18 years. That's a long time. He was never the star, but, he was 7-1. He gave teams what they needed. And 18 years to be a player, that's not bad. So, he is like the first big number 44 in basketball. Next came Derek Coleman. Derek Coleman is interesting because Derek Coleman, if he had only hit one of those foul shots, Syracuse might have had a chance for their first national championship back in '87. I don't even want to go there with it. But anyhow, Derek Coleman was the only basketball player in Syracuse history, still is, matter of fact, who was a number one draft choice for the NBA. And he was drafted by New Jersey. And he stayed there for a good long while. And for a while, after he, left Syracuse, he was the number one rebounder and shot blocker ever in history. So that's pretty good. And then we had John Wallace. John Wallace he was also a Big East All-American. He did really well. He got drafted kind of high into the NBA. But here, we recognize him as the guy who basically put the Syracuse team on his back and led them to the national championship game in 1996 against a monster Louisville team led by Rick Pitino, who was either number one or number two all year long. And then a ref called a bad call on him. And Syracuse at that time was tied with Louisville, and then they ended up losing by 9. Anyway, that's basketball. Now let's get to football. So football, who we have is, I'm going to start off with Ernie Davis. Ernie Davis is the only football player in Syracuse history who won the Heisman Trophy. And he would have been the first, as a matter of fact, let me rephrase that. He was picked number one to play at the Cleveland Browns, but then he ended up with leukemia and he passed away. So he never got to play professional football. I'll come back to him in a minute. Then we had Floyd Little. Floyd Little, when he was here, when he left, he was number one in total yards. He was also named the player. Actually, I can't remember what the name of the league was at that time. I didn't write that part down. But he was big in Eastern football. He got drafted by the Denver Broncos. He basically went into both the college and professional football Hall of Fame. And he was a big deal. He was also, he was just a good guy. He is still doing a lot of things in the Syracuse area for Syracuse University and a whole bunch of different charity organizations. So he's still a really liked guy. But we've got the last guy I'm going to mention here because he's the reason for the video. His name just happens to be a guy named Jim Brown. Jim Brown, he played 4 sports at Syracuse. He did track, he did lacrosse, he did basketball, and for the life of me, I can't remember the 4th one. And I wrote that down, and I don't remember the 4th one. But he was All-American in football. He was All-American in lacrosse. And unfortunately, back then, black people didn't get Heisman trophies or any other big trophies until Ernie Davis did. And when Ernie Davis was drafted number 1, he would have been on the same team as Jim Brown. And we might be talking about the Cleveland Browns dynasty instead of what the New England Patriots did. So Jim Brown was a big deal, and he was a number 44. And, you know, the thing about Jim Brown is that then he went into the NFL. He just crushed records. He was the hardest guy to bring down. He was a tough guy. He was big for a running back at that time. And if you just go on YouTube and you look up Jim Brown, you will see he hurt people. He hurt people. 235-pound running back. You didn't have a lot of those back then. And he was just hard to stop. And he only played, I think it was 9 years. And then he just up and retired. He was still in his prime, but he had stuff to do. In his opinion, he had stuff to do. He decided to go into movies. He was a civil rights activist. He was praised by a lot of athletes and a lot of civil rights people across the country. And athletes in all different sports. There are pictures of him with all these people, you know, Muhammad Ali and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was Lou Alcindor back then, and Jackie Robinson. You know, he was a big deal. He was in a movie with Raquel Welch, and in essence was one of the first interracial kisses in movies in color. So he took his shot, you know. It was a big deal. Jim Brown, for a lot of my youth and my early 20s, this dude was kind of a hero. I mean, you know, he wasn't my favorite player of all time. You know, my favorite athlete is Muhammad Ali. My second favorite is Roberto Clemente, but Jim Brown was pretty much there. He was right there. Like I said, the Syracuse history, everything else. And then the allegations started coming. Jim Brown was known to abuse women. Sexually, physically, he was known for hitting women. This was a thing this guy did. And it messed with my mind for the longest time because I don't tolerate bad behavior. And this was probably one of the biggest people at the time, you know, popularity and everything else, where it's like, wow, how do I judge that? And with everybody else since then, whenever I've heard of certain bad behaviors, I've gotten rid of their, you know, anything that I owned of them. For instance, the musicians. If I heard really bad stuff and then they got convicted of it because it could be proven or whatever, I got rid of all that stuff. I either threw it away or I erased it. Bill Cosby was a big hero of mine for decades. And then we all know what happened with him. Got rid of the records that I had. I erased everything else. No Bill Cosby stuff. I didn't own any Jim Brown stuff. So I didn't have to get rid of anything. The number 44, which I'm showing in the thumbnail, which I'm wearing right now, well, other players wore number 44. You know, Jim Brown wasn't first. He wasn't last. It was just the number in this area. And just to show you how big the number 44 is, Syracuse University was granted the zip code to end in 44. 13244. Syracuse University. That's it. I don't know if there's a lot of communities across the country who got that, but Syracuse University did, so there you go. And it's just that mixed thing in my mind where I sit there and I think, wow, you know, he did some good things for civil rights and for, you know, breaking through in the movies, you know, showing that black person could be a good actor, show that, you know, he was tough. He didn't take any mess from anybody. Nobody turned Jim Brown down and told Jim Brown what to do. he was a great athlete. He did all this stuff, but you can't forgive the other stuff. He even wrote about it in one of his autobiographies. I guess he wrote 2 autobiographies, neither of which I read, but in one of them, he talked about this thing that he had where he knew that he was in the wrong in physically abusing these women and doing these things. And it's the one thing that stuck with him until he passed away. It's hard when someone that you admired that much does some of this other stuff. And this is not necessarily a tribute video because of the other stuff. It's just a video where I mentioned the good stuff, I've mentioned the bad stuff, and I mentioned this is a complicated guy. And all I've seen most of the week of all these different write-ups is how great an athlete he was, the kind of man he was in general terms, the civil rights stuff he did, all the famous people he did, that he met. And then a couple of them did mention the stuff that he did against a lot of women. A lot of women. I don't know. I mean, how does everyone else kind of handle something like this? I mean, like I said, I didn't own anything by him. I never read any of his biographies because I knew what had happened. I've never read a history book on Jim Brown. He's listed in the Syracuse book that I have, talking about, Syracuse sports and the number 44. He's listed in there, but he's not the only person listed in there, so I'm not getting rid of my, local Syracuse sports book. But, it's one of those kind of things where you have this dichotomy of thoughts. This is someone who could have gone down as one of the greatest athletes in history, and people would have revered him, and there's nothing else. He probably would have ended up making a lot more money. He probably would have been a lot more famous across the world. He had his chance to be the football version of Muhammad Ali. But you can't go around assaulting women. And all of them were way smaller than him. Like I said, Jim Brown was a tough guy. And he scared a lot of other athletes because he was a tough guy. So, I don't know. I'd like to know what some of you think. I know there's going to be some people, they may not leave, that comment on the video because nobody wants to be seen as someone who condones women being beaten or violence against women. But some may say we should just remember him for the good he did. How has that worked out for anybody else? That's just a general question. Anyway, that's what I got. My name is Mitch Mitchell. I don't know if I can say I hope you enjoyed this video, so I'll just say this time around, I hope you watched it, and I hope you give a comment on it. I don't know if there'll be any other videos like this one. And I don't have a big channel, so I'm not going to get 1,000 comments or anything. It's probably not going to get even 50 views, but I've had my say. Y'all take care.